Emma had always believed that true happiness came from the simplest things in life. Growing up in a small coastal town surrounded by rolling hills and the salty breeze of the ocean, she learned to appreciate the beauty of ordinary moments. Her days were filled with teaching young children at the local elementary school, where laughter echoed through the hallways and crayon drawings decorated the walls. But her evenings? Those belonged to Daniel, or Dan as everyone called him. Dan was the mechanic at the only auto repair shop in town. His hands were often covered in grease, his clothes stained from hours spent fixing engines under the hood of old cars. Yet despite his rugged appearance, there was something undeniably charming about him. He wasn't loud or flashy. Instead, he had this quiet way of making people feel comfortable, whether it was offering a warm smile to a nervous customer or cracking a light-hearted joke while tightening bolts. Dan seemed to have an innate ability to connect with others. Emma first met Dan when her car broke down on a rainy afternoon. She had been driving home after a long day at work when the engine sputtered and died just outside the repair shop. Frustrated and soaked from the downpour, she pushed open the door of the garage, hoping someone could help her. That's when she saw him, leaning over an open hood, his dark hair streaked with oil, his focus completely absorbed in his task. "Need a hand?" he asked, glancing up with a grin that instantly put her at ease. From that moment, their paths began to cross, more frequently. At first it was purely practical. Emma would drop off her car for routine maintenance and Dan would return it promptly, always ensuring it ran smoothly. But over time, their interactions grew longer. Conversations started naturally, about the weather, then about hobbies, and eventually about deeper topics like dreams and aspirations. Dan listened intently whenever Emma spoke, asking thoughtful questions that showed he genuinely cared. And Emma found herself doing the same, curious about the man behind the wrenches. What struck her most about Dan was his humility. Despite working long hours in a physically demanding job, he never complained. In fact, he seemed to take pride in what he did. Once, when Emma commented on how hardworking he must be to keep the shop running so efficiently, he shrugged modestly and said, "It's not about the money. It's about solving problems and helping people get back on the road." That comment stuck with Emma. There was a sincerity in his voice that resonated with her own values. Unlike some of the other men she'd known, who boasted about their achievements or chased material success, Dan appeared content with his simple life. He didn't own a fancy house or drive an expensive car. Instead, he lived in a cozy little apartment above the garage, decorated with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with books. It was clear that he valued experiences over possessions, much like Emma did. Their friendship blossomed into something more during one particularly memorable evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emma had stayed late at school grading papers, and by the time she arrived at the garage to pick up her car, it was nearly dark. To her surprise, Dan was still there, tinkering with an old motorcycle that had seen better days. "You don't give yourself enough credit," Emma teased as she watched him polish the bike's rusted frame. "This thing looks almost new already." Dan chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Almost isn't good enough. I won't stop until it's perfect." Their conversation flowed effortlessly that night, moving from motorcycles to childhood memories to favorite books. By the time they finally parted ways, both realized they'd shared more than just words. They'd shared pieces of themselves. From that point on, their bond deepened. They started spending weekends together, exploring hidden corners of the town, sharing meals at tiny diners, and stargazing on quiet beaches. To Emma, Dan was everything she'd ever wanted in a partner. He was kind, dependable, and refreshingly real. What she didn't know, however, was that Dan carried a secret, one so profound that it could change everything between them. Beneath his worn coveralls and unassuming demeanor lay a truth that even those closest to him barely understood. Unbeknownst to Emma, Dan wasn't just a mechanic trying to make ends meet. He hailed from one of the wealthiest families in the country, heirs to a business empire spanning multiple industries. But Dan had grown disillusioned with the lavish lifestyle and constant scrutiny that came with his family name. So years ago, he made the bold decision to leave it all behind, trading penthouse suites and private jets for a humble existence in a sleepy seaside town. Here, among people who judged him not by his wealth but by his character, he felt free to be himself. For a while, Dan convinced himself that keeping his past hidden was harmless. After all, what did it matter if Emma thought he was simply a hard-working mechanic? It wasn't as though he was lying outright. He was fixing cars every day, after all. But as their relationship grew stronger, guilt began to creep in. Every compliment Emma gave him about his dedication and perseverance felt bittersweet, because she didn't know the full story. And the longer he waited to tell her, the heavier the burden became. Still, Dan couldn't bring himself to shatter the illusion, not yet. For now he cherished the simplicity of their connection, treasuring each moment they spent together without the shadow of his family legacy looming overhead. Little did he know, fate had plans of its own, and soon, the truth would come tumbling out in a way neither of them could have anticipated. As the seasons changed, so did the depth of Emma and Daniel's relationship. What had started as a series of casual conversations at the garage blossomed into something far more meaningful. Their weekends became sacred, a time to escape the routine of daily life and explore the world around them, even if that world was just their small coastal town. Together they discovered hidden trails through the woods, quiet coves along the shoreline, and cozy cafes tucked away on side streets. Each outing felt like an adventure, no matter how simple it might have seemed to outsiders. One Saturday morning, Emma arrived at the garage with a picnic basket in hand. "I found this recipe for homemade sandwiches," she said with a playful smile. "Thought we could test them out." Daniel raised an eyebrow, pretending to inspect the basket skeptically. "You're not trying to poison me, are you?" She laughed, swatting his arm lightly. "Just come on, I know a spot down by the beach where we can eat without anyone bothering us." The two loaded up Daniel's old truck, its paint chipped and faded from years of use, and drove toward the coast. The air smelled of salt water and pine, and the sound of seagulls filled the silence between their easy banter. When they reached the secluded stretch of sand Emma had mentioned, Daniel couldn't help but marvel at how peaceful it felt. There were no tourists here, no noise, just the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. They spread out a blanket and unpacked the food. As they ate, Daniel listened intently while Emma talked about her students, sharing funny stories about their antics in class. She described one little boy who insisted on drawing dinosaurs on every assignment, no matter the subject. "He says they're historical figure," she explained with a grin. "I haven't had the heart to correct him yet." Daniel chuckled, leaning back on his elbows. "Sounds like a smart kid. Maybe he's onto something. Dinosaurs were pretty important?" Emma rolled her eyes good-naturedly but couldn't hide her smile. It amazed her how Daniel always managed to make her laugh, even when she wasn't trying to be funny. He had this way of turning ordinary moments into something special, simply by being present and paying attention. After lunch, they wandered along the water's edge, skipping stones and watching the tide roll in. At one point, Emma stopped abruptly, pointing to a cluster of rocks jutting out into the ocean. "Look, is that a seal?" Daniel squinted, shading his eyes with his hand. Sure enough, a sleek gray figure lounged atop the rocks, basking in the sunlight. "Yeah, it is," he confirmed. "Must have gotten separated from its group." For a while they stood there together, mesmerized by the sight. It was moments like these, quiet, unspoken, that made Emma realize just how much she cared for Daniel. She didn't need grand gestures or extravagant displays of affection. All she needed was him, standing beside her, sharing in the wonder of the world. Back in town, their connection continued to deepen. On rainy evenings, they'd hole up in Daniel's apartment above the garage, cooking meals together and talking late into the night. Sometimes they'd lose track of time entirely, only realizing how late it had gotten when the rain stopped and the room grew eerily quiet. Other nights, they'd sit by the window, sipping tea and watching lightning streak across the sky. It wasn't all idyllic, of course. Like any couple, they had their disagreements. Once, Emma teased Daniel about leaving tools scattered around the apartment, and he jokingly accused her of hoarding books until there was barely any space left on the shelves. But these little spats never lasted long. They always ended with laughter and apologies, each one bringing them closer rather than driving them apart. What struck Emma most about Daniel was his unwavering kindness. He treated everyone with respect, whether it was a wealthy businessman dropping off a luxury car or a struggling single mother needing a quick fix on her sedan. One afternoon, Emma witnessed this firsthand when a young woman walked into the garage looking flustered. Her car had broken down and she didn't have enough money to pay for repairs. "I'll figure something out," Daniel assured her, already rolling up his sleeves. "Don't worry about it." Later, Emma asked him why he didn't charge her. "She's got kids in the back seat," he replied simply. "Sometimes people need help more than they need bills." That selflessness resonated deeply with Emma. In Daniel, she saw a man who truly lived his values, a stark contrast to some of the people she'd encountered in her own life. He reminded her of her father, who had taught her the importance of compassion and integrity. Losing him years ago had left a void in her heart, but being with Daniel somehow made it feel a little less empty. For Daniel, falling in love with Emma was both exhilarating and terrifying. On one hand, she was everything he'd ever wanted: intelligent, compassionate, and fiercely independent. She challenged him to think differently and inspired him to be better. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the fear that someday she'd discover the truth about his past and see him in a completely different light. He tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the joy they shared. They spent countless evenings stargazing on the roof of his apartment building, wrapped in blankets as they identified constellations and made up stories about the shapes they saw in the sky. One night, Emma pointed to a particularly bright star and asked, "Do you think wishes really work?" Daniel tilted his head, considering the question. "Depends on what you're wishing for." "What if I told you I wished for happiness?" she said softly, her gaze fixed on the heavens. He turned to look at her, his chest tightening with emotion. "Then I'd say your wish has already come true." Moments like that made Daniel question whether he deserved someone as wonderful as Emma. He knew he couldn't keep hiding behind his fabricated identity forever, but the thought of telling her the truth terrified him. What if she felt betrayed? What if she walked away? Still, he clung to hope. Every time Emma smiled at him, every time she reached for his hand or rested her head on his shoulder, he convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, she would understand. Until then, he resolved to cherish every second they had together, knowing that the clock was ticking on his secret. As summer gave way to autumn, the leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold, Emma and Daniel found themselves growing even closer. They began dreaming aloud about the future, tossing around ideas for trips they wanted to take and places they wanted to see. Emma joked about buying a camper van and traveling the country, while Daniel suggested renting a cabin in the mountains for a winter getaway. But beneath the surface of their happy planning, a storm was brewing, one that neither of them could foresee. For now, though, they remained blissfully unaware, caught up in the magic of their love. And in those fleeting moments, nothing else mattered. The crisp air of autumn had settled over the coastal town, painting the world in shades of amber and gold. Leaves crunched underfoot as Emma and Daniel strolled through the park one Saturday afternoon, their hands intertwined. The season felt symbolic somehow, a time of transition, of change, and neither of them could ignore the quiet certainty growing between them. They hadn't spoken the words yet, but both knew where this was heading. Love had taken root in their hearts, and it was flourishing with every passing day. One evening, as they sat together on Daniel's rooftop, wrapped in blankets to ward off the chill, Emma turned to him with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Do you ever think about forever?" Daniel paused, the question catching him off guard. He'd been staring at the stars, lost in thought, but now his focus shifted entirely to her. "Forever?" he repeated, his voice soft. "Yeah," she said, shrugging as if trying to play it casual. "You know, like, what comes next for us?" He hesitated, his mind racing. Forever was a big word, especially for someone carrying a secret as heavy as his. But looking into Emma's warm, trusting eyes, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, or the future they might build together. I think about it more than I should, he admitted finally, a small smile tugging at his lips. But only because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Emma's cheeks flushed and she looked away, pretending to study the constellations above. Well, that's good to know, she murmured, her tone teasing but laced with sincerity. Because I feel the same way. That night, as they walked back to her car, Daniel made a decision. It wasn't the right moment to reveal everything, not yet, but it was time to take the next step. He wanted to show Emma just how serious he was about their future. Over the next few weeks, he began making plans, carefully considering every detail. This wasn't just any proposal, it was a promise to honor the love they shared, even if part of him still feared what might happen when the truth eventually came out. A month later, on a cool Friday evening, Daniel invited Emma to meet him at their favorite beach. She arrived wearing a light sweater, her hair tousled by the ocean breeze. As she approached, she spotted Daniel standing near the water's edge, illuminated by the fading light of the setting sun. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and he seemed unusually nervous. "You're late," he teased when she reached him, though his smile betrayed his excitement. "I had to feed Mr. Whiskers," she replied, referring to her stubborn tabby cat. "Besides, anticipation is half the fun." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped closer. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he began, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. Inside him, Emma tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" Reaching into his pocket, Daniel pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath caught as he sank down onto one knee, the waves lapping gently behind him. Opening the box, he revealed a simple, silver ring adorned with a modest diamond. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, just perfect, much like their relationship. "Emma," he said, his gaze locked onto hers. "From the moment I met you, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You make me want to be better, to dream bigger, and to hold on to hope even when things seem uncertain. Will you marry me? Will you spend the rest of your life with me?" Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she stared at him, momentarily speechless. The sound of the ocean faded into the background, leaving only the two of them in that magical moment. Finally, she nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Yes." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to embrace her tightly. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other as the sky turned shades of lavender and pink. When they finally pulled apart, Emma laughed through her tears. "You planned this perfectly, didn't you?" "I had some help," Daniel admitted with a sheepish grin. "Your friend Sarah gave me tips." Emma groaned, laughing again. "Of course she did. She's probably been waiting for this since we started dating." As they drove home that night, Emma couldn't stop admiring the ring on her finger. It sparkled faintly in the dim light of the dashboard, a tangible reminder of the commitment they'd just made. Yet amidst her happiness, a tiny flicker of curiosity lingered in the back of her mind. Something about the evening felt almost too perfect, as if Daniel had gone to great lengths to ensure every detail aligned seamlessly. Still, she pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to pre-wedding jitters. Planning the wedding became a joyful adventure for both of them. Emma insisted on keeping things simple and intimate, which suited Daniel perfectly. A small ceremony on the beach, surrounded by close friends and family, sounded ideal. They spent weekends visiting local bakeries to taste cakes, browsing thrift stores for vintage decorations, and sketching ideas for floral arrangements. Every decision brought them closer, reinforcing the bond they shared. But as the months passed, Daniel found himself grappling with guilt. He loved Emma more than anything, but the weight of his secret pressed heavily on his chest. How could he stand before her on their wedding day and vow honesty and transparency when he hadn't been fully truthful from the start? Each time Emma mentioned how proud she was of his hard work, or how inspiring it was that he'd built his life from scratch, Daniel flinched internally, knowing the truth was far more complicated. To distract himself, he threw himself into helping with the preparations. He built wooden arches for the ceremony, painted signs with quirky quotes, and even attempted to sew table runners, though those ended up looking more like abstract art. Emma laughed at his efforts, teasing him about his lack of sewing skills, but she appreciated the effort nonetheless. "You don't have to do all this," she told him one afternoon as they worked side by side in his garage-turned-workshop. "I mean, you're already doing so much." "I want to," Daniel replied earnestly. "This is our day. I want it to be special." Emma smiled, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "It will be, because it's with you." Despite her reassurance, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that their perfect bubble would burst sooner or later. He knew he couldn't keep hiding who he really was, not from Emma, not from anyone. The question wasn't if he'd tell her, it was when. And deep down, he feared that the answer might come too late. As the wedding date drew nearer, strange occurrences began to unsettle Emma. She noticed unfamiliar luxury cars parked outside Daniel's garage more frequently, their sleek designs standing out against the backdrop of rusted sedans and pickup trucks. Once, while dropping off supplies for the reception, she overheard fragments of phone calls. Hushed voices discussing investments, board meetings, and private jets. None of it made sense in the context of Daniel's supposedly modest lifestyle. Curiosity got the better of her one afternoon, and she decided to surprise him by stopping by the garage unannounced. Pushing open the door, she froze in her tracks. Standing near the counter was a sharply dressed man in an expensive suit, his posture commanding and his expression serious. He glanced up as Emma entered, giving her a polite nod before turning. "Back to Daniel. We need to finalize the contracts before Monday," the man said firmly. "Your father won't wait much longer." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Contracts? Father? What was going on? Before she could say anything, Daniel noticed her standing there. His face paled, and he quickly ushered the man toward the exit. "We'll talk later," he muttered, closing the door behind him. Turning to Emma, he forced a smile, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "Hey," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Who was that?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "No one important," Daniel replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Just a client negotiation." Emma studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of deception. But Daniel's expression remained calm, albeit slightly strained. Reluctantly, she let the matter drop, for now. That night, lying awake in bed, Emma replayed the scene in her mind. Something wasn't adding up, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Was Daniel hiding something? Or was she simply overthinking things? Either way, she resolved to keep an open mind. After all, trust was the foundation of their relationship. If there was something Daniel needed to tell her, she trusted that he'd do so in his own time. Little did she know, time was running out. As the wedding day approached, Emma found herself caught between excitement and unease. The preparations were nearly complete. Invitations had been sent, flowers ordered, and dresses fitted. But something still felt off. It wasn't just the odd moments she'd witnessed at Daniel's garage. It was a growing sense that pieces of his life didn't quite fit together. She tried to push these thoughts aside, reminding herself how much she loved him and how silly it was to let paranoia creep in. Yet no matter how hard she tried, the questions lingered. One afternoon, while helping her mother sort through old photo albums for the reception slideshow, Emma stumbled upon a picture of herself as a child, standing beside a shiny black luxury car during a family vacation. The memory brought a smile to her face until she realized the insignia on the hood looked eerily familiar. Squinting at the image, she recognized it as the same emblem she'd seen on one of the cars parked outside Daniel's garage recently. "Mom," Emma said slowly, pointing to the photo. "Do you remember whose car this was?" Her mother glanced at the picture and shrugged. "Oh, that? I think it belonged to some businessman who sponsored the resort we stayed at." "Why?" Emma hesitated, unsure how to explain her sudden interest. "No reason," she muttered, closing the album. But deep down, the coincidence gnawed at her. Businessmen didn't usually frequent Daniel's modest repair shop, or so she thought. Meanwhile, Daniel was drowning in guilt. His secret felt heavier with each passing day, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He knew he couldn't keep pretending forever, but every attempt to tell Emma ended in silence. How could he break such monumental news without shattering the fragile trust they'd built? Still, the cracks were beginning to show, and he feared it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his father and lawyers, demanding updates on his decision about returning to the family business. They'd grown impatient with his prolonged absence, threatening to cut him off entirely if he didn't comply. At first, Daniel ignored their calls, focusing instead on wedding plans and spending time with Emma. But as deadlines loomed closer, ignoring them became impossible. One evening, after another tense conversation with his father, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, staring at the engagement ring he'd given Emma. It sparkled softly under the dim light, a symbol of the promises he'd made and the ones he hadn't kept. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. Telling Emma the truth now would risk ruining everything. Waiting until after the wedding felt equally wrong. Either way, he was trapped in a web of his own making. The next morning, Emma decided to confront Daniel, not aggressively, but gently. She wanted answers, not accusations. When she arrived at the garage, she found him hunched over an engine, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, she watched him work, marveling at how effortlessly he moved, his hands skilled and precise. This was the man she loved, the man who had captured her heart with his kindness and humility. Whatever secrets he might be hiding, she reminded herself, wouldn't change that. "Hey," she said softly, stepping closer. Daniel looked up, startled. "Emma, what are you doing here?" "I came to see you," she replied, forcing a smile. "Can we talk for a minute?" He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded, following her outside where they could speak privately. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of salt water from the nearby ocean. Emma took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Dan, is there something you're not telling me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. Daniel froze, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Lately I've noticed things. Strange cars showing up at the garage, those phone calls you seem reluctant to take. And then there's the guy in the suit I saw last week. You said he was just a client, but—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the question hanging in the air. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew this moment would come eventually, yet nothing could have prepared him for the knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "Emma," he began, his tone heavy with regret. "I owe you an explanation, but I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," she urged, her gaze unwavering. "Whatever it is, Dan, I deserve to hear it." He swallowed hard, his mind racing. Could he really tell her everything? Would she understand why he'd hidden the truth for so long? Or would she see his actions as betrayal? "You remember when I told you I left my old life behind because I wanted something real?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "Yes. Well, what I didn't tell you is, my old life wasn't what you think it was." He paused, searching for the right words. "My name isn't just Daniel. It's Daniel Hawthorne III. My family owns one of the largest corporations in the country. I walked away from all of it because I hated the superficiality, the pressure, the expectations. I wanted to live authentically, to find meaning beyond money and status." Emma stared at him, her heart pounding. Her heart. The name sounded vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place it immediately. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I was scared," Daniel admitted, his eyes filled with anguish. "Scared you'd see me differently, scared you'd think I was lying or using you. But mostly I was scared of losing you. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Emma. I didn't want anything to ruin what we have." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the silence, echoing the turmoil swirling inside Emma. Her mind raced, trying to process what she'd just heard. Was this the same man she'd fallen in love with? The man who fixed cars, shared meals with her, and dreamed of a simple life together? Or was he someone else entirely? Finally, she broke the silence. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I can't keep living a lie," Daniel replied, his voice breaking. "Not with you. Not when we're about to get married. I need you to know the real me, even if it means losing you." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she absorbed his words. Part of her felt betrayed, hurt that he'd kept such a significant part of himself hidden for so long. But another part understood his struggle, the fear of being judged, of being reduced to a name or a bank account. She cared about him deeply, more than she cared about any title or fortune. Still, the revelation left her reeling. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "This is a lot to take in." Daniel nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand. Take all the time you need." As Emma walked away, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, she couldn't help but wonder how this revelation would change everything. Their relationship, their future, it all hung precariously in the balance. Yet, amidst the chaos, one thing remained clear. Love wasn't always easy. Sometimes it required facing uncomfortable truths and making difficult choices, and Emma knew that whatever happened next, she owed it to both of them to approach it with honesty and an open heart. Days passed, and the tension between them grew palpable. Emma avoided discussing the topic further, throwing herself into last-minute wedding preparations instead. Daniel, meanwhile, withdrew slightly, giving her space but silently hoping she'd forgive him. Neither of them mentioned the looming wedding date, though it weighed heavily on their minds. On the eve of the big day, Emma sat alone on the beach, staring out at the horizon. The sun dipped below the waves, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She thought about all the moments she and Daniel had shared, the laughter, the adventures, the quiet nights under the stars. Despite everything, she couldn't deny the depth of her feelings for him. He had shown her what true love looked like, not perfection but vulnerability and growth. As darkness fell, she made her decision. Tomorrow she would stand by Daniel's side, not because of his name or his wealth, but because of the man he was beneath it all. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Love, she realized, wasn't about avoiding storms. It was about weathering them side by side. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, with the sun casting golden rays over the small coastal town. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt water and blooming flowers. Emma stood in front of the mirror in her childhood bedroom, adjusting the delicate lace of her gown. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed out invisible wrinkles, her mind racing with thoughts of the day ahead. She had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying Daniel's confession over and over in her head. His words echoed in her mind, "I need you to know the real me." It wasn't just his family name or wealth that he'd revealed. It was his vulnerability, his fear of being misunderstood, and his desire to live authentically. Despite the shock of his secret, Emma couldn't ignore the sincerity in his voice, or the love reflected in his eyes. She cared for him deeply, but the weight of his deception still lingered like a shadow. Her mother entered the room quietly, holding a bouquet of wildflowers they had picked together earlier that week. "You look beautiful," she said softly, placing the flowers on the bed. Emma forced a smile, though her heart felt heavy. "Thanks, Mom." Her mother studied her for a moment, sensing the turmoil beneath the surface. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything feels complicated right now." Her mother sat beside her, taking her hand. "Love isn't always easy, sweetheart. Sometimes it asks us to forgive, to trust, and to grow. But if your heart tells you this is worth fighting for, then don't let fear get in the way." Emma nodded slowly, absorbing her mother's words. She knew what she needed to do, but that didn't make it any less daunting. At the beach, chairs, were arranged in neat rows overlooking the ocean, adorned with ribbons and sprigs of greenery. A wooden arch decorated with white roses stood at the center, swaying gently in the breeze. Guests mingled nervously, some glancing toward the entrance where Emma would soon appear. Daniel paced near the altar, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He looked every bit the picture of a nervous groom, though his anxiety stemmed from far more than pre-wedding jitters. He kept replaying their conversation from the other day, wondering if he'd made the right choice to reveal his truth. So close to the wedding. Would Emma forgive him? Would she see past his family name and understand why he'd hidden it? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making each passing minute feel like an eternity. Finally, the music began. A soft melody played by a string quartet, and all eyes turned toward the aisle. Emma appeared, escorted by her father, her gown flowing gracefully around her. The sight took Daniel's breath away. She looked radiant, her expression calm despite the storm brewing inside her. As she approached, Daniel locked eyes with her, silently pleading for understanding. When Emma reached the altar, her father kissed her cheek before stepping aside. Daniel took her hand, his touch warm yet hesitant. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the world fading into the background. Then the officiant began speaking, his voice steady and reassuring. "Friends and family," he began, "we gather here today to celebrate the union of two souls who have chosen to walk through life together." The ceremony proceeded smoothly, with vows exchanged and rings slipped onto fingers. Just as the officiant prepared to pronounce them husband and wife, he paused, gesturing subtly toward the back of the venue. Doors swung open, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. In walked a group of impeccably dressed individuals, their presence commanding attention. At the forefront was a tall, distinguished man with sharp features and piercing eyes, a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Daniel. Behind him trailed assistants carrying folders and tablets, their expressions serious and professional. Emma froze, her grip tightening on Daniel's hand. She recognized the man immediately. It was Richard Hawthorne, CEO of Hawthorne Industries, whose face had been splashed across magazine covers and news headlines for years. The man who had built an empire and who now stood glaring at his son. Daniel stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Dad," he said evenly, though his voice betrayed a flicker of unease. "What are you doing here?" Richard ignored the question, addressing the guests instead. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone authoritative, "my apologies for interrupting, but there are matters that must be addressed before this ceremony continues." A hush fell over the crowd. Emma's heart raced as she glanced between Daniel and his father, unsure of what was happening. Daniel turned to face her, his expression a mixture of guilt and determination. "Emma," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. "I am Daniel Hawthorne III, heir to my father's company. I left that life because I wanted to escape the pressure, the expectations, and the superficiality. I came here to find meaning, to be someone authentic, and then I met you." His gaze softened as he looked at her, his words pouring out in a rush. "You've shown me what real love looks like. You've accepted me for who I am, not for my name or my money. But I can't marry you without being completely honest. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid of losing you." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on Emma, waiting for her reaction. Tears welled up in her eyes as she processed his words. Betrayal, confusion, and even anger swirled within her. But beneath it all was the undeniable truth. She loved him. Not his title, not his fortune. Him. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice steady, despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Is this true?" she asked, her gaze searching his. Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with regret and hope. "Every word." Emma exhaled sharply, her mind racing. This was the moment of reckoning, the crossroads where love and trust collided with doubt and betrayal. She glanced at the crowd, at Richard's stern face and the bewildered expressions of their friends and family. Then she looked back at Daniel, seeing not the wealthy heir, but the man who had fixed her car, shared meals with her, and dreamed of a simple life together. "I don't care about your last name or your bank account," she said finally, her voice firm. "I care about you, but next time, maybe don't wait until our wedding day to share something this big." Relief washed over Daniel's face as he pulled her into a tight embrace. Cheers erupted from the guests, many of whom wiped away tears of joy. Even Richard, who had initially seemed unyielding, softened slightly, watching the couple with a hint of pride. As the ceremony resumed, Emma and Daniel exchanged their final vows, sealing their commitment with a kiss. The tension that had hung in the air moments earlier dissolved into laughter and applause. Friends and family surrounded them, offering congratulations and hugs. Though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, adjusting to Daniel's high-profile life and navigating the complexities of his family dynamics, they faced them together, united by love and honesty. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma and Daniel danced under twinkling fairy lights, their hearts lighter than they had been in days. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but they also knew one thing for certain. Love, when genuine, could transcend even the most unexpected revelations. The wedding reception buzzed with energy, a mix of laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Fairy lights twinkled above, casting a warm glow over the beach as waves lapped gently at the shore. Emma and Daniel stood hand in hand, accepting congratulations from their guests, many of whom were still processing the dramatic twist that had unfolded earlier. Some whispered behind cupped hands, while others simply marveled at how the couple had handled it all with grace. Despite the whirlwind of emotions, Emma felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally out. No more secrets, no more wondering what else might be hidden beneath the surface. She glanced at Daniel, who looked both exhausted and exhilarated, his smile brighter than she'd seen it in days. There was no denying the weight of what had happened, but there was also something liberating about facing reality head-on. As the evening wore on, Richard Hawthorne approached them, his demeanor far less imposing than before. He cleared his throat awkwardly, drawing their attention. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Daniel exchanged a glance with Emma, silently seeking her approval. She gave him a small nod, trusting him to navigate this moment. Together they stepped aside, leaving the lively celebration behind. "I owe you both an apology," Richard began, surprising them both. "I didn't mean to disrupt your special day. I came here because I was worried about you, Daniel." Daniel raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Worried or trying to control me again?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Maybe both. But seeing you today, with her, I realized something. You're not the same person you were when you left. You've grown. And maybe I haven't been the father you needed." Emma watched as Daniel's expression softened, though he remained cautious. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to try," Richard replied earnestly. "If you'll let me. Not as the CEO of some corporation, but as your dad." For a moment, Daniel said nothing, his emotions swirling visibly. Finally, he extended his hand. "It's a start." Richard shook it firmly, relief evident in his eyes. Then, turning to Emma, he added, "And thank you for loving him enough to forgive him today." Emma smiled faintly, unsure of how to respond. While she appreciated the sentiment, she knew building trust with Richard would take time. Still, it was a step in the right direction. Later that night, after most of the guests had departed, Emma and Daniel found themselves alone on the beach. They sat side by side on a blanket, the cool sand beneath them and the stars above. The sound of the ocean provided a soothing backdrop as they reflected on the events of the day. "So," Emma said after a long pause, her voice teasing, "was this the kind of wedding you imagined when you proposed?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Not exactly. I was hoping for fewer interruptions and less drama." "Yeah, well," she teased, nudging him playfully. "You're not exactly Mr. Ordinary Mechanic anymore, are you?" He grinned sheepishly. "Guess I should have come clean sooner." Emma grew quiet, her expression thoughtful. Why didn't you, really? Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I guess I was scared. Scared that if you knew who I really was, you'd see me differently. That you'd think I was just another spoiled rich guy playing dress-up. I wanted you to love me for me, not for my last name or my bank account. And now, she pressed gently. And now, he admitted, meeting her gaze. I know you do. Love me, I mean, even after everything. She nodded, her smile softening. I do, but Dan, you have to promise me something. Anything. No more secrets, she said firmly. From now on, we face things together, no matter what. He reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Deal. In the weeks that followed, Emma and Daniel began adjusting to their new reality. Moving into Daniel's penthouse apartment, a sleek modern space overlooking the city skyline, felt surreal at first. Gone were the mismatched furniture and cozy clutter of his old apartment above the garage. Instead, they were surrounded by polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and state-of-the-art appliances. It was beautiful, but it lacked the warmth they'd shared before. To bridge the gap, Emma insisted on adding personal touches, framed photos of their adventures. Together, handmade blankets draped over the couch and potted plants scattered throughout the space. Slowly, the sterile luxury transformed into a home that reflected their personalities. Navigating Daniel's high-profile life proved challenging. Paparazzi occasionally camped outside their building, snapping photos whenever they stepped outside. Social media buzzed with speculation about Emma, her background, her lifestyle, her suitability as Daniel's wife. At first, it overwhelmed her, but Daniel reassured her every step of the way. You're stronger than they think, he told her one evening, wrapping his arms around her. Let them talk. None of it matters unless we let it. Emma nodded, leaning into his embrace. Just promise me one thing. What's that? That we never lose sight of who we are. Not the fancy cars or the big parties, but us. The real us. He kissed her forehead, his voice steady. We won't. Richard, too, made an effort to mend his relationship with Daniel. He visited often, bringing stories of board meetings and business deals, but also asking questions about their lives, genuine curiosity replacing the distant authority he'd once exuded. Over time, Emma warmed to him, recognizing the loneliness beneath his stoic exterior. One afternoon, as they sat together on the balcony, Richard turned to Emma. You've changed him, you know. She raised an eyebrow, surprised. How so? He's happier, Richard explained simply. More grounded. Before, he always felt like he had something to prove. To me, to everyone. Now, he seems at peace. Emma smiled, glancing toward Daniel, who was tinkering with an old motorcycle he'd brought to the penthouse. That's all I ever wanted, for him to be happy. Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. Thank you for that. Life wasn't without its challenges, of course. Balancing Daniel's responsibilities with their desire for simplicity required compromise. They attended galas and charity events, but always made time for quiet weekends away. Emma continued teaching, refusing to give up the career she loved, even as Daniel encouraged her to pursue other passions. Together, they carved out a life that honored both their values and their dreams. On a crisp spring morning nearly a year after their wedding, Emma stood on the balcony, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the city. Daniel joined her, rapping, his arms around her waist. You know, he mused, resting his chin on her shoulder. If someone had told me back then, the day we met, that I'd end up here, I wouldn't have believed them. Emma laughed softly. Me neither. Who would have thought a broken-down car could lead to all this? It wasn't the car, Daniel corrected, kissing her temple. It was you. She leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Well, wherever we go next, I'm glad we're going together. And as the city stirred to life below them, Emma and Daniel embraced the future, not as individuals defined by titles or expectations, but as partners united by love, trust, and the unshakable belief that true happiness comes not from wealth or status, but from the connections we nurture and the authenticity we share.